Okay. Super annoying. YouTube Live did that weird thing where all of a sudden it went silent with no volume. So I'm going to take over where the volume ended. It looked like it went through about 3 minutes and 30 seconds. So if you're watching this now, there's another video that I just trimmed that has the first 3 minutes. And I will take over where it left off. All right, so we left off in chapter 8, where they're talking about Aslan. She won't turn him into stone too, said Edmund. Lord love you, son of Adam. What a simple thing to say, answered Mr. Beaver with a great laugh. Turn him into stone? If she can stand on her 2 feet and look him in the face, it'll be the most she can do and more than I expect of her. No, he'll put all to rights, as it says in an old rhyme in these parts. Wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death, and when he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. You'll understand when you see him. But shall we see him again? Asked Susan. Why, daughter of Eve, that's why I brought you here for. I'm to lead you where you shall meet him, said Mr. Beaver. Is he a man? Asked Lucy. Aslan a man? Said Mr. Beaver sternly. Certainly not. I tell you, he's the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan. I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Oh, that you will, dearie. Make no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just plain silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Miss Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. And that is the most famous quote from this book about who said anything about safe. Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. Because everybody's like, how can he not be safe? But he's good. I'm longing to see him, said Peter, even if I do feel frightened when it comes to that point. That's right, son of Adam, said Mr. Beaver, bringing his paw down on the table with a huge crash that made all the cups and saucers rattle. And so you shall. Word has been sent that you are to meet him tomorrow, if you can, at the stone table. Where's that? Said Lucy. I'll show you, said Mr. Beaver. It's down the river, a good step from here. I'll take you to it. But meanwhile, what about poor Mr. Tumnus? Said Lucy. The quickest way you can help him is by going to meet Aslan, said Mr. Beaver. Once he's with us, then we can begin actually doing things. Not that we don't need you to, for that's another of the old rhymes. When Adam's flesh and Adam's bone sits at Cair Paravel enthroned, the evil time will be over and done. So things must be drawing near their end now that he's come and you've come. We've heard of Aslan coming into these parts before, long ago. Nobody can say when. But there's never been any of your race here before. Well, that's what I don't understand, Mr. Beaver, said said Peter. I mean, isn't the witch herself human? Well, she'd like us to believe that, said Mr. Beaver, and it's on that she bases her claim to be queen. But she's no daughter of Eve. She comes of your father Adam's, here Mr. Beaver bowed, your father Adam's first wife. They called her Lilith, and she was a jinn, which is a fairy. That's what she comes from on one side, and on the other she comes from the giants. No, there isn't a drop of real human blood in that witch. That's why she's bad all the way through, Mr. Beaver, said Mrs. Beaver. True enough, Mrs. Beaver, replied he. There may be two views about humans, meaning no offense to my present company, but there's no two views about things that look like humans and aren't. Well, I've known some good dwarfs, said Mrs. Beaver. Yeah, so have I, now that you speak of it, said her husband. But precious few, and they were the ones least like men. But in general, take my advice. When you meet anything that's going to be human and isn't yet, or used to be human once and isn't now, or ought to be human and isn't, you keep your eyes on it and feel for your hatchet. And that's why the witch is always on the lookout for any humans in Narnia. She's been watching for you this many a year, and if she knew there were 4 of you, she'd be even more dangerous. What's that got to do with it? Asked Peter. Because of another prophecy, said Mr. Beaver. Down at Cair Paravel, that's the castle on the sea coast down at the mouth of this river, which ought to be the capital of our entire country if all was as it should be. Anyway, down at Cair Paravel, there are 4 thrones, and it's a saying in Narnia, time out of mind, that when 2 sons of Adam and 2 daughters of Eve sit in these 4 thrones, then it will be the end, not only of the White Witch's reign, but of her life. And that is why we had to be so cautious as we came along, for she knew about you 4. Your lives wouldn't be worth a shake of my whiskers. All the children had been attending so hard to what Mr. Beaver was telling them that they had noticed nothing else for a really long time. Then during that moment of silence that followed his last remark, Lucy suddenly said, I say, where's Edmund? There was a dreadful pause, and then everyone began asking, who saw him last? How long has he been missing? Is he outside? And then all rushed to the door and looked out. The snow was falling thickly and steadily. The green ice of the pool had vanished under a thick white blanket, and from where the little house stood in the center of the dam, you could hardly see either bank. Out they went, plunging well over their ankles into the soft new snow, and they went round the house in every direction. Edmund! Edmund! They called till they were hoarse, but the silently falling snow seemed to muffle their voices, and there was not even an echo in answer. How perfectly dreadful, said Susan as they came back in despair. Oh, how I wish we'd never come here. What on earth are we supposed to do, Mr. Beaver? Said Peter. Do, said Mr. Beaver, who was already putting on his snow boots. Do? We must be off at once. We haven't a moment to spare. We better divide into 4 search parties, said Peter, and we'll all go in different directions. Whoever finds them must come back here at once and... Search parties, son of Adam, said Mr. Beaver. What for? Why, to look for my brother Edmund, of course. No, there's no point looking for him, said Mr. Beaver. What do you mean, said Susan. He can't be far away yet, and we've got to find him. What do you mean when you say there's no use looking for him? The reason there's no use looking, said Mr. Beaver, is that we already know where he's gone. Everyone stared in amazement. Don't you understand, said Mr. Beaver. He's gone to her, to the White Witch. He's betrayed us all. Oh, surely, really, he couldn't have done that, said Susan. Can't he, said Mr. Beaver, looking very hard at the 3 children. And everything they wanted to say died on their lips, for each felt suddenly quite certain inside that that was exactly what Edmund had done. But will he know the way, said Peter. Has he been in this country before, asked Mr. Beaver. Has he been here alone? Yeah, said Lucy in a whisper. I'm afraid he has. Did he tell you what he did or who he met? No, he didn't, said Lucy. Then, mark my words, said Mr. Beaver, he has already met the White Witch and joined her side and been told where she lives. I didn't like to mention it before, he being your brother and all, but the moment I set eyes on that brother of yours, I said to myself, treacherous. He had the look of one who had been with the witch and eaten her food. You can always tell them if you live long enough in Narnia. Something about their eyes looks funny. All the same, said Peter in a rather choking sort of voice, we'll still have to go and look for him. He is our brother after all, even if he is rather a little beast. He is only a kid. Go to the witch's house, said Mrs. Beaver. Don't you see that the only chance of saving either him or yourselves is to keep away from her? How do you mean, said Lucy. Why, all she wants is to get all 4 of you. She's thinking all the time of those 4 thrones at Cair Paravel, you know. Once you were all 4 inside her house, her job would be done, and there'd be 4 new statues in her collection before you had time to even speak. But she'll keep him alive as long as he's the only one that she's got, because she'll want to use him as a decoy, as bait to catch the rest of you with. So no one can help us? Wailed Lucy. Only Aslan, said Mr. Beaver. We must go on and meet him. That's our only chance. It seems to me, my dear, said Mrs. Beaver, that it's very important to know just when he slipped away. How much he can tell her depends on how much he's heard. For instance, had we even been talking of Aslan before he left? If not, then we might do okay, for she won't know that Aslan has come to Narnia or that we're meeting him, and that she'll be caught off her guard as far as that is concerned. I don't remember his being here when we were talking about Aslan, began Peter, but Lucy interrupted him. Ah, yes, he was, she said miserably. Don't you remember? It was he who asked whether the witch could turn Aslan into stone. He did, by Jove, said Peter. Just the sort of thing that Edmund would say. Worse and worse, said Mr. Beaver. And the next thing is this. Was he still here when I told you that the place for meeting Aslan was at the stone table? And of course, no one really knew the answer to that question. Because if he was, continued Mr. Beaver, then she'll simply sledge down in that direction and get between us and the stone table and catch us on our way down. In fact, we shall be cut off from Aslan completely. But that isn't what she'll do first, said Mrs. Beaver. Not if I know her. The moment that Edmund tells her that we're all here, she'll set out to catch us this very night. And if he's been gone about half an hour, according to my calculations, she'll be here in the next 20 minutes. You're right, Mrs. Beaver, said her husband. We must all get away from here. There's not a moment to lose. All right, chapter 9. I'm going to read it again. So Edmund is heading off towards the witch's house. He's freezing cold. He doesn't have his jacket. He kind of wishes he could turn back, and he's really miserable. And to be honest, I don't feel bad for him at all since he's deceived his brothers and sisters. But there's a part of me that does feel a little bit bad, like he's still a kid, right? Think about like siblings who drive us crazy. And sometimes we're like, ugh, but deep down we love them, right? All right, in the witch's house. And now, of course, you want to know what had happened to Edmund. He had eaten his share of the dinner, but he hadn't really enjoyed it because he was thinking the whole time about Turkish delight. And there's nothing that spoils the taste of good, ordinary food half so much as the memory of bad magic food. And he had heard the conversation, but he hadn't enjoyed it very much because he kept on thinking about the others were taking no notice of him and trying to give him the cold shoulder. Well, they weren't, but he imagined all this. And then he had listened until Mr. Beaver told them about Aslan until he heard the whole arrangement for meeting Aslan at the stone table. So he did hear. It was then that he began very quietly to edge himself under the curtain which hung over the door, for the mention of Aslan gave him a mysterious and horrible feeling, just as it gave the others a mysterious and lovely feeling. Just as Mr. Beaver had been repeating the rhyme about Aslan's flesh and Adam's bone, Edmund had been very quietly turning the door handle, and just before Mr. Beaver had begun telling them about the White Witch wasn't really human at all, but half djinn and half giantess, Edmund had got outside into the snow and cautiously closed the door behind him. You mustn't think that even now Edmund was quite so bad that he actually wanted his brothers and sisters to be turned into stone. He did want Turkish delight, and he did want to be prince and king later, and to pay Peter out for calling him a beast. As for what the witch would do with the others, he didn't want her to be particularly nice to them, but certainly not to put them on the same level as himself. But he did manage to believe, or pretend to believe, that she wouldn't do anything super bad to them. Because he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half of it isn't even true. She was jolly nice to me anyway, much nicer than they are. I expect she is the rightful queen, really. Anyway, she'll be better than that awful Aslan. At least that was the excuse he made in his own mind for what he was doing. It wasn't a very good excuse, however, for deep down inside him, he knew that the witch actually was really bad and cruel. The first thing he realized when he got outside was he found that the snow was falling all around him and that he had left his coat behind in the beaver's house. And of course, there was no chance of going back to go get that now. The next thing he realized was that the daylight was almost gone, for it had been nearly 3 o'clock when they sat down to dinner, and the winter days were short. He hadn't reckoned on this, but he had to make the best of it. So he turned up his collar and shuffled across the top of the dam. Luckily, it wasn't so slippery since the snow had fallen, to the far side of the river. It was pretty bad when he reached the far side. It was growing darker every minute, and with that and the snowflakes swirling all around him, he could hardly see even 3 feet ahead of him. And then, too, there was actually no road. He kept slipping into deep drifts of snow and skidding on frozen puddles and tripping over fallen tree trunks and sliding down steep banks and barking his shins against the rocks till he was wet and cold and bruised all over. Again, don't really feel bad for him. The silence and the loneliness was dreadful. In fact, I really think he might have given up his whole plan and gone back and owned up and made friends with the others if he hadn't happened to say to himself, when I'm king of Narnia, the first thing I'm going to do is make some decent roads around here. And of course, that set him off thinking about being a king and all the other things he would do. And this cheered him up a good deal. He had just settled his mind and what sort of palace he would have and how many cars and all about his private cinema and where the principal railways would run and what laws he would make against beavers and dams and putting his finishing touches to some schemes for keeping Peter in his place when the weather suddenly changed. First, the snow stopped, then a wind sprang up and it became freezing cold. Finally, the clouds rolled away and the moon came out. It was a full moon, and shining on all that snow, it made everything almost as bright as day. Only the shadows were rather confusing. I want you to notice in the book, too, whenever it kind of gets cold and dreary, usually the wind is blowing, usually the White Witch is near, and when it's like sunny and the birds are chirping, it means Aslan is near. He would never have found his way if the moon hadn't come out by the time he got to the other river. You remember he had seen, when they first arrived at the Beavers, a small river flowing into a great one that was lower down. Well, he now reached that one and turned to follow it up, but the little valley down which it came was much steeper and much rockier than the one that he had just left, and much more overgrown with bushes, so that he could not have managed it at all in the dark. Even as it was, he got wet through, for he had to stoop under branches, and great loads of snow came sliding off onto his back. And every time this happened, he thought more and more about how he hated Peter, just as if all of this was Peter's fault somehow. But at last he came to a part where it was more level and the valley opened out. And there on the other side of the river, quite close to him, in the middle of a little plain between two hills, he saw what he figured must be the White Witch's house. And the moon was shining brighter than ever. The house was really actually a small castle. It seemed to be all towers, little towers with long pointed spires on top of them, sharp as needles. They looked like huge dunce caps, or actually sorcerer's caps, and they shone in the moonlight, and their long shadows looked strange on the snow. Edmund began to be afraid of her house. But it was too late to think of turning back now. He crossed the river on the ice and walked up to the house. There was nothing stirring, not the slightest sound heard anywhere. Even his own feet made no noise on the deep, newly fallen snow. He walked on, past corner after corner of the house, and past turret after turret, to looking for a door. He had to go right around to the far side before he found it. It was a huge arch, but the great iron gate stood wide open. That's kind of creepy. Why are the gates open if she's so evil? Edmund crept up to the arch and looked inside the courtyard, and there he saw a sight that nearly made his heart stop beating. Just inside the gate, with the moonlight shining on it, stood an enormous lion, crouched as if it was ready to spring. And Edmund stood in the shadow of the arch, afraid to go on and afraid to go back, with his knees completely knocking together. He stood there so long that his teeth would have been chattering with cold, even if they had been chattering with fear. How long this really lasted, I don't know, but it seemed to Edmund to last for hours. Then at last he began to wonder why the lion was standing, for it hadn't even moved a single inch since he first set eyes on it. Edmund now ventured a little closer, still keeping in the shadow of the arch as much as he could. He now saw from the way the lion was standing that it couldn't have been looking at him at all. But supposing it turns its head, thought Edmund. In fact, it was staring at something else, namely a little dwarf who stood with his back to it about 4 feet away. Aha, thought Edmund. When it springs at the dwarf, then it'll be my chance to escape. But still, the lion never moved, and neither did the dwarf. And now at last Edmund remembered what the others had said about the White Witch turning people into stone. Perhaps this was only a stone lion, and as soon as he had thought of that, he noticed that the lion's back and the top of his head were covered with snow. And of course it must be a statue. No living animal would let itself get covered with snow. Then very slowly, and with his heart beating as if it would burst, Edmund ventured to go up to the lion. Even now he hardly dared to touch it, but at last he put out his hand very quickly and did. It was cold stone. He had been frightened of a mere statue. The relief which Edmund felt was so great that in spite of the cold, he suddenly got warm all over right down to his toes, and at the same time, there in his head, what seemed a perfectly lovely idea. Probably, he thought, this is the great lion Aslan that they were all talking about. She's already caught him already, and she's turned him into stone. Here's a little image of him in the courtyard. So he was so scared of this statue, and now he's like, I'm not scared of this guy. Well, that's the end of all their fine ideas about him. Pooh! Who's afraid of Aslan? So he stood there gloating over the stone lion, and presently he did something really silly and childish. He took a stump of lead pencil out of his pocket, and he scribbled a little mustache on the lion's upper lip, and then he put a pair of spectacles on his eyes, and then he said, silly old Aslan, how do you like being made out of stone? You thought yourself mighty fine, didn't you? But in spite of the scribbles on it, the face of the great stone beast still looked so terrible and sad and noble, staring up in the moonlight, that Edmund really didn't get any fun out of jeering at it. He turned away and began to cross the courtyard. And as he got into the middle of it, he saw that there were dozens and dozens of statues all about, standing here and there, rather as the pieces stand on a chessboard when it's halfway through the game. There were stone satyrs, stone wolves, bears, foxes, catamountains of stone. There were lovely stone shapes that looked like women, but who were really the spirits of the trees. There was the great shape of a centaur and a winged horse and a long, lithe creature that Edmund took to be a dragon. They all looked so strange, standing there, perfectly lifelike, but also perfectly still in the bright, cold moonlight, that it was eerie work crossing the courtyard. Right in the very middle stood a huge shape like a man, but it was as tall as a tree, with a fierce face and a shaggy beard and a great club held in his right hand. That's one of my favorite characters, by the way. Even though he knew that it was only a stone giant and not a live one, Edmund did not like walking past him. He now saw that there was a dim light showing from a doorway on the far side of the courtyard. He went to it, and there was a flight of stone steps going up to an open door. Edmund went up to them. Across the threshold there lay a great wolf. It's all right, he said to himself. It's only a stone wolf. It can't hurt me. And as he raised his leg to step over it, instantly the huge creature rose with all the hair bristling along its back, opened a great red mouth, and said in a growling voice, "Who's there? Who's there? Stand still, stranger, and tell me who you are." "If you please, sir," said Edmund, trembling so that he could hardly speak. My name is Edmund, and I'm a son of Adam, and Her Majesty met me in the wood the other day, and I've come to bring her the news that my brother and sisters are now in Narnia. Quite close, actually, in the beaver's house. She wanted to see them." "I will tell Her Majesty," said the wolf. "Meanwhile, stand still on the threshold as you value your life." And then he vanished into the house. Edmund stood and waited, his fingers aching with cold and his heart pounding in his chest, and presently the gray wolf named Mogrim, the chief of the witches' secret police, came bounding back and said, come in, fortunate favorite of the queen, or else maybe not so fortunate." And Edmund went in, taking great care not to tread on the wolf's paws. He found himself in a long, gloomy hall with many pillars, full as the courtyard had been of statues. And the one nearest to the door was a little fawn with a really sad expression on his face. And Edmund couldn't help wondering if this might be Lucy's friend. The only light came from a single lamp, and close behind this sat the White Witch. "I've come, Your Majesty," said Edmund, rushing eagerly forward. "How dare you come alone?" said the witch in a terrible voice. "Did I not tell you to bring the others with you?" Please, Your Majesty," said Edmund, "I've done the best I can. I've brought them quite close. They're in a little house on top of the dam just up the river with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver." A slow, cruel smile came over the witch's face. "Is this all your news?" she asked. No, Your Majesty," said Edmund, and proceeded to tell her all he had heard before leaving the beaver's house. "What? Aslan?" cried the queen. "Aslan, is this true? If I find that you've lied to me—" "Please, I'm only repeating what they said," stammered Edmund. But the queen, who was no longer attending to him, clapped her hands. Instantly, the same dwarf whom Edmund had seen with her before appeared. "Make ready our sledge," ordered the witch, "and use the harness without the bells." So why do you guys think that she wants to use a sleigh with no bells on it this time? All right, so Edmund didn't get the warm welcome that he wanted. No talk of even Turkish delight. And the kids are in grave danger because the witch is on a sleigh, which is much faster than walking through the snow. So it's no bueno. So reminder to take your social studies test today. The link was sent to your parents. You have till 5 o'clock today. Also in your response journal, 3 vocabulary words for each chapter, 8 and 9, answering your questions. And I think it talks about, I love that quote about, is he safe? And they're like, of course he's not safe, but he's good. So you're going to interpret what that means in your own opinion. And I will see everybody tomorrow for 2 more chapters. See you then. Bye.